The food the entire world treats as the ultimate symbol of freshness spent its first 1,000 years buried underground, rotting on purpose. If you came here expecting a clean story about Japan, ancient mastery, and the spiritual art of the knife, you are, weirdly, in the right place. But the story you are actually about to hear is stranger than that. Sushi, the food that today shows up in airport kiosks, Michelin kitchens, grocery coolers, and children's birthday parties, did not begin as cuisine. It began as a panic solution to a problem that no refrigerator yet existed to solve. Strip away the cedar counter and the serious vocabulary of cuts and grades, and what you find underneath is not elegance. It is anxiety. The question driving everything from here. How does a food that starts in fear and rot become the thing you order to celebrate the best moments of your life? Because the answer involves at least two completely separate civilizations arriving at the exact same trick, separated by roughly 2,000 years, and, almost nobody has ever noticed. By the end of this, you will see that they are the same move. But before we go back to the very beginning, and the beginning is further back, and further from Japan than most people expect, let me give you the moment when sushi finally looks the way it looks today. Because that moment did not happen in silence or ceremony. It happened in one of the noisiest, hungriest, most chaotic cities on earth. And it looked nothing like what we now call fine dining. In the early 19th century, Edo, the city that would become Tokyo, was one of the most densely populated places on the planet. And we are talking about a city running at full volume. Labourers, merchants, boat traffic, night markets, entertainment districts, and, an absolute roar of daily commerce. The bay stretching out in front of the city, which people called Edomae, literally in front of Edo, was loaded with seafood, and the streets were loaded with people who did not have time to sit down for anything. The popular story says a chef named Hanaya Yohei started selling Nigiri from a stall in the Ryogoku district around 1824. Look, the Japan Foundation's major sushi exhibition calls this a popular legend, so even the most authoritative sources won't fully commit to the founding myth. What they will say is that whether or not Yohei personally invented nigiri, he was definitely the first to make it commercially successful, and can realistically be said to have perfected it. Real food history rarely hands you a single inventor anyway. What it gives you is a crowded field of people all trying the same thing, and one person remembered because the form they championed eventually won. What Yohei understood, better than anybody around him, was the tempo of the city. He starts out carrying sushi through the crowds on portable wooden boxes, walking the demand. Eventually, he opens a permanent shop in the Ryogoku. His sushi uses fresh materials, assembles in seconds, sells cheap enough that labourers can actually afford it. And many of those labourers, are men living in Edo without families, no kitchen, no wife, nobody cooking for them. They need fuel. He provides it. Fast. And here is the first reversal in this entire story. The food that today arrives in rooms where you remove your shoes and trust the chef with every decision first became famous as working-class fast food. Cheap, immediate, eaten standing up, probably next to a canal. The pieces were, enormous by modern standards. Each nigiri was roughly 2 to 3 times the size of what you would find in a restaurant today. 3 pieces made a full meal. There is a Senryu poem from the era, preserved in illustrated books of Edo street life, that compares watching Yohei chef shape rice to watching a magician perform. And you can see why. A handful of seasoned rice becomes a form in seconds. A strip of fish lands on top. A full meal appears in under a minute. After centuries of sushi taking months, literal months to be ready, watching it assembled in 60 seconds must have felt astonishing. And it wasn't just stall food, right. There were delivery men, illustrated books from the Edo period, including sketches by the writer and illustrator Kitagawa Morisada, show deliverymen carrying boxes of nigiri through the city streets, which, 2 centuries before apps and scooters, people in Edo already had food that came to them, quickly, on demand. Sushi was, in a very real sense, the first fast food delivery system. Now, here is the detail that almost nobody volunteers when they tell this story. The fish was not raw. Kikkoman's food culture history is completely explicit about this. In the 1820s, the toppings on nigiri were typically marinated in salt, vinegar, or soy sauce, or else simmered or grilled, specifically to prevent spoilage in a city with zero refrigeration. The clean, cool, barely touched raw fish aesthetic that now defines sushi globally is not what Hanaya Yohei was serving. What he was serving was fast, cheap, and still, like every version of sushi before it, negotiating with the same old enemy: time. And already, right there in that same decade, sushi's double identity was fully on display. The Japan Foundation notes that Yohei's permanent shop eventually became so elaborate and expensive that it violated Edo's sumptuary laws, regulations designed to stop luxury goods from circulating outside the social strata they were meant for, and Yohei was jailed. He got arrested for making sushi too luxurious. In 1824's Edo, the same food was simultaneously street fuel for labourers and a product upscale enough to get you thrown in jail for selling it. That contradiction is not a modern corruption of some older purity. That contradiction was always there. It is, in a way, the whole story. But to understand why even Yohei's most modern sushi was still fighting spoilage in 1824, you have to go back much further than Yohei, much further than Japan. You have to go back to a world where sushi took not seconds to make, but months, and where the smell of the finished product was something most people today would not recognize as food at all. The actual birthplace of sushi is disputed. Credible sources place the earliest form in southern China or Southeast Asia, with more specific accounts pointing to the river valleys of the Mekong basin, somewhere between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE. So, we are talking roughly 2,500 years ago. The certainty ends there. What survives more reliably than any map is the logic. The water is warm, the catch is good, and the problem is immediate. Fish start dying the second they leave the river, and in a subtropical climate, that turns to inedible within days. The solution, something that may have emerged independently in several places, went like this. Gut the fish, rub it with salt, pack it tightly into a vessel with cooked rice, press it under heavy weight, then wait. Not days, months. The rice in this system is not food, it is chemistry. Under pressure, it ferments, acidifies, and creates an environment where the bacteria that would otherwise destroy the fish simply cannot survive. The rice is sacrificed. The fish lives. When it is finally ready, sometimes half a year later, you throw away the broken down sour rice and eat the preserved flesh. This is narezushi, and it is, almost nothing like what we call sushi today. It is not pristine. It does not arrive on lacquer. It does not require a vocabulary of grades and seasons. It is, at its most fundamental level, a solution to a problem, the taste of necessity rather than pleasure. The Japan Foundation's sushi exhibition makes the point clearly. Closely related fermented fish and rice preparations still exist in parts of continental Southeast Asia, the Mekong and Irrawaddy basins, and the practice most likely moved through China before reaching Japan. Kikkoman's food culture history is equally direct. Sushi did not originate in Japan. Japan would transform it more completely than any other civilization on Earth. But it arrived as an import, not an invention. The first solid written evidence in Japan appears in the Yoroi Code of 718, a legal administrative document compiled under Empress Gensho, where the characters for sushi show up in an official list of taxable goods. By the early 10th century, records already distinguished between regional forms. Funazushi, made from Crucian carp around Lake Biwa in what is now Shiga Prefecture. Ayuzushi in Gifu. And Japan's Ministry of Agriculture identifies funazushi as the oldest surviving form of narezushi, and the direct ancestor of everything that eventually followed. That ancestor, is still alive. In Shiga today, some families still salt the crucian carp, pack it with rice, press it under weight, and wait, sometimes longer than a year. Modern funazushi is intensely, deeply sour, pungent in a way that makes the strongest aged European cheese seem restrained and polite by comparison. It is the taste of preservation refusing to apologize for what it is. And a 12th century Japanese story collection, the Konjaku Monogatari, preserves an anecdote where fermented sushi is described as simultaneously delicious and unmistakably alarming. Delicious and alarming. Which, okay, is a very specific combination that turns out to be one of the great hidden engines of sushi's entire subsequent history. Because almost every transformation the food makes from this point forward is, at its core, the same single move. Keep the usefulness, soften the assault. So sushi spends its first 1,000 years in Japan as a food of patience, buried under weight, aged in the dark. Ready when time decides, not when hunger does. And then, somewhere around the 15th century, someone makes a change that sounds almost too small to matter. It is everything. People started eating the rice. I know that sounds like nothing. It is everything. In the old preserved form, the rice had done its chemical job and got discarded. But by around the 15th century, makers started shortening the fermentation period, producing what sources call namanare, half-fermented sushi. The rice, no longer fully broken down by months of waiting, was still edible, still tart, still present, still worth keeping. Both the Ministry of Agriculture and Kikkoman's history call this the genuine turning point. Fish and rice were no longer a preservation mechanism and its sacrificial byproduct. They were, for the first time, a meal together. You can feel the human desire in that shift. It is the desire to eat sooner, to suffer less, to make the useful thing less severe. Shorter fermentation meant a less punishing smell, less complete surrender to time, less distance between the work and the reward. The tartness remained, but the whole thing was changing character. What had been an ordeal was becoming something closer to food you would actually choose. And from that pivot, the shortcuts multiplied fast. Kikkoman traces how, across the 16th and 17th centuries, makers started using koji mold, sake, and vinegar to manufacture the sourness that months of fermentation had previously produced on its own. At first, these are just aids, accelerants. By the 18th century, vinegar is the primary vehicle for sushi's acidity, and the months of waiting have compressed into hours of assembly. This is the world of hayazushi, fast sushi, the form that the Ministry of Agriculture identifies as the direct ancestor of nigiri. And here is, the central paradox that the food has to live with from this point forward. Sushi didn't abandon its ancient sourness. It learned to fake it. Faster. On demand. The identity stayed. The mechanism completely changed. That is worth sitting with for a second, because it is going to matter a lot later. Regional forms multiply in this space, right? Pressed sushi in lacquered boxes in Osaka, fish wrapped in persimmon leaves or bamboo in other regions. Layered constructions in the Kansai tradition. Sushi is becoming a category, not a single dish, many different things sharing one memory. And the direction across all of them is the same. Closer to the moment of eating. Less burial, more craft. Less patience, more timing. And as history today notes, this shift mirrors what is happening in Japanese society more broadly. Urbanization, trade, faster rhythms of daily life. The old logic of long-term preservation weakens as commerce expands. Once necessity loosens its grip, you know what rushes in? Style. Most people, if you ask them what defines modern sushi, point to one thing: raw fish. The cold, translucent, barely touched slice that seems to carry the whole ocean's dignity inside it. And look, that image is real. But it hides a specific and very surprising fact. The most iconic visual element of contemporary sushi is not ancient. It was made possible by a machine invented in the 20th century. In Edomae Nigiri's first decades, as we have seen, the fish was almost never raw. History today confirms exactly what Kikkoman states. Before reliable cold storage, serving fish completely unpreserved and uncooked meant accepting significant spoilage risk. In a city with no refrigeration, toppings were marinated, salted, simmered or grilled, treated in ways that bought them time against decay. The pristine, barely touched, almost architectural raw fish aesthetic that now defines sushi globally belongs not to any ancient tradition, but to the 20th century, and specifically to the arrival of widespread refrigeration. Kikkoman names the development of cold chains as one of the decisive post-war transformations in sushi history. And what cold storage gave sushi, I mean this quite specifically, was not a new flavor. It gave sushi permission to finally look the way the form had always implied, but could never deliver. Untouched. Immediate. Alive. Before the cold chain, raw fish was available, consistently safe, visually spectacular, available everyday raw fish. That is an industrial achievement. The modern aesthetic of sushi was born in the freezer, and cold made sushi expensive, and that expense became meaningful. Kikkoman records that during Japan's rapid economic growth in the 1960s and 70s, nigiri at sushi restaurants assumed an upmarket and costly position. A chef who could maintain a cold chain and present raw fish under conditions of visible precision and control was offering something that signaled refinement, occasion, cultivated taste. The same food that had been Edo's working-class fuel had become the dinner you ordered to mark a promotion. The reversal completes itself one more time. But while one future of sushi moved upward in formality and price, another was being engineered in Osaka in 1958. And this is one of my favorite details in this story. The inspiration came from a beer factory. A small restaurant owner had been watching bottles move on a production line conveyor at a brewery. Nobody carrying them, just moving. And he applied that observation directly to food service. Individual plates of nigiri placed on a moving belt circling the dining room, each plate priced by color. What he built, kaiten-zushi, conveyor belt sushi, was more than a labor solution. It was emotionally transformative. The belt removed the anxiety of ordering. Every plate was visible before you committed to it. Standard pricing meant no fear of an unexpected bill. The Japan Foundation notes that a kaiten branch at Expo 70 in Osaka introduced this format to visitors from across Japan and the world, and that conveyor belt sushi was, to use the Osaka Convention and Tourism Bureau's framing, instrumental in transforming sushi from a luxury into an everyday delicacy for ordinary people. And the Japan Foundation draws the comparison explicitly. The spirit of the kaiten restaurant, speed, selection, spectacle, is the direct descendant of Edo's yatai street stalls. Same soul. Electric belt instead of a wooden carrying box. By October 2023, Japan's Ministry of Agriculture had counted approximately 187,000 Japanese restaurants operating overseas. And you know, one authoritative sushi exhibition could note almost casually that the form now most familiar to many diners worldwide is not the cedar counter omakase. It is the belt. By the time sushi crosses the Pacific in force, it has already survived the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which killed more than 100,000 people and scattered Tokyo's sushi chefs across Japan, helping spread Edomae style nationwide. And wartime rice rationing so severe that in 1947, with grain government controlled, sushi shops kept operating by becoming technically food processing contractors. Customers brought their own rice. The chef turned it into sushi. The grain itself was too precious to sell freely. That kind of tested, that kind of repeatedly bent and never broken. And then it arrives in America, of all places, and does what it has always done. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History places sushi's first major American foothold in Little Tokyo, Los Angeles, where it gains visibility and cultural cachet in the post-war decades among Japanese businessmen and their American colleagues. And mid-century American eating culture was, hearty, meat-heavy, and not naturally prepared for the quiet restraint of raw fish over vinegared rice. So sushi chefs on the Pacific coast start experimenting. A Smithsonian account from 2022 reports the California roll was developed by sushi chefs in Little Tokyo in the mid-1960s. Avocado replaces expensive fatty tuna, and the nori, seaweed, unfamiliar, slightly alarming to many North American diners, gets hidden inside the roll, with rice on the outside. So the first thing a new customer sees is something that looks neutral, familiar, approachable. No visible seaweed, no confronting rawness, just a roll. The authorship is disputed though, right? A Smithsonian piece from 2016 reports Japan honouring Hidekazu Tojo, a Vancouver chef credited with developing the inside-out roll after opening his restaurant in 1971, specifically working to make sushi less intimidating for North American customers. The Los Angeles story and the Vancouver story don't cancel each other out. They confirm the more honest account. The California roll was not a single invention. It emerged from a field of experimentation across the Pacific coast, in which chefs were all asking the same question. How do you get someone to love a thing that frightens them? And the answer they reached was 1,500 years old. Go back to the 15th century. Namanare. Shorten the fermentation. Keep the fish. Keep the rice. Remove the element that most offends. Make the useful thing more approachable without abandoning what makes it work. Now come forward to the mid-1960s, Los Angeles, the California roll. Replace the most alarming ingredient. Hide the element that most unsettles. Keep the structure. Make the useful thing more approachable without abandoning what makes it work. The moves are identical. The gap between them is 2,000 years. And here is the thing that makes this even wilder. The adaptation succeeded so completely that it reversed itself. The Smithsonian notes that adventurous diners who first needed the California roll soon decided that sushi, raw, spare, demanding, was sophisticated, even glamorous. By 1996, a chef named Ryuji Ishii had introduced pre-packaged supermarket sushi to American grocery stores on a large scale. The same civilization that needed avocado to enter the room was within a generation, picking up sushi at the checkout line, tracking tuna grades, and arguing online about which cut of bluefin was worth ordering. Americans who needed avocado in 1965 eventually wanted raw tuna. Workers who needed vinegar shortcuts in the 18th century eventually treated ancient fermented narezushi as a nostalgic delicacy. Laborers who ate at Edo street stalls eventually elevated the same food into the most expensive dining format in the city. The adaptation always, eventually, points back to what it was adapting away from. Every single time. Without exception. In 2013, Washoku, Japan's traditional dietary culture, was inscribed on UNESCO's representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. A food that started as a panicked answer to the problem of rot in a river valley had become part of the world's officially recognized, irreplaceable inheritance. And even now, the story is not settled. The Japan Foundation's sushi exhibition included 150 contemporary examples, a quiet admission that there is no single frozen moment, called authentic sushi, waiting at the end of history. The global appetite for sushi has grown large enough to raise serious questions about oceanic sustainability, pushing chefs and diners to think hard about which fish can still be served without collapsing the systems they come from, which is, just the newest version of the oldest questions sushi has ever asked. How do you keep something precious from disappearing? And somewhere in Shiga Prefecture, on the shores of Lake Biwa, someone is still making funatsushi, the way it has been made for over 1,000 years. Salt the fish, pack the rice, apply the weight, wait, not hours, not days, months, sometimes longer than a year. The oldest surviving form of the food, practically unchanged since before Japan had a written language, still exists inside the same country that invented the conveyor belt restaurant and the airport kiosk tray. The timeline has never broken. It has only kept moving. So here is what the full arc reveals once you have watched sushi bend through every century and every ocean crossing. It is not a cuisine of freshness. It never was. It is a cuisine of controlled loss, a form built on the recognition that things disappear and on the intelligence to decide deliberately how much of them to release in order to keep the rest alive. Every transformation in this story, from the fermented barrel to the vinegar shortcut, from the Edo stall to the cold chain, from the seaweed hidden roll in Los Angeles to the UNESCO inscription in 2013, is the same negotiation replayed in a new place against a new version of the same old threat. Something valuable is at risk. You change exactly enough to save it, and what survives the change turns out to be the thing that lasts. The piece you hold tonight, whether it arrived on lacquer or in a supermarket tray, whether someone pressed it beside Tokyo Bay or assembled it in a kitchen in Sao Paulo or Milano, carries that entire history in it, whether you can taste it or not. Preservation turned into pleasure. Anxiety turned briefly into order. The oldest human refusal to let something precious rot, held between two fingers, and then gone. Was there a moment you first tasted something made the old, slow way, fermented, aged, built by time rather than by convenience, and felt, just for a second, like you were eating something that had absolutely refused to disappear? Tell me what it was in the comments. These replies always turn into something worth reading. If you are the kind of person who finds the version underneath the version more interesting than the official story, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe and stay for the next one.